Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the forests grew thick and wild, Park Ranger Tom Hawkins patrolled the winding trails of Blue Ridge National Park. He had been working these woods for over a decade and thought he knew every nook and cranny of the spiraling wilderness. But on this crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves crunched beneath his boots, Tom was about to stumble upon a secret that would shake him to his very core. The day had started like any other. Tom had risen before dawn, kissed his wife Sarah goodbye, and driven in his weathered pickup to the ranger station. He'd checked in with dispatch, grabbed his pack, and set out on his usual rounds. But as he hiked deeper into the remote backcountry, something felt off. The birds were too quiet, and the air was too still. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Tom paused at a fork in the trail, frowning as he consulted his map. To the left lay Blackwater Creek, a popular camping spot. To the right, a seldom used path snaked up into the higher elevation. On a whim, Tom decided to take the right fork. He had been meaning to check on some of the more isolated campsites, and today seemed as good a day as any to do so. As he climbed higher into the mountains, the trees grew denser, their gnarled branches blotting out the sun. Tom's radio crackled with static. The signal was growing weaker the further he went. He was just about to turn back when he spotted something that made him stop in his tracks. There, half hidden behind a rotting log, was a child's teddy bear. Its once fluffy fur was matted and stained, one button eye dangling by a thread. Tom's heart sank. Lost toys weren't uncommon in the park, but something about this one filled him with unease. He picked it up gingerly, noting the forest debris clinging to the damp surface. The bear hadn't been dropped recently. It had been there for months, maybe even years. Tom scanned the surrounding area, looking for any other signs of a human presence, and that's when he saw it. A faint path leading off the main trail, barely visible beneath the thick undergrowth. It wasn't on any of his maps, and he was certain it hadn't been there the last time he had patrolled this section. Every instinct told Tom to radio for backup and return to the station, but curiosity got the better of him. Gripping his flashlight tightly, he pushed through the tangled brush and followed the hidden path. The trail wound deeper into the mountains, becoming steeper and more treacherous with each step. Tom had used his hands to scramble over moss-covered boulders and fallen trees. The forest pressed in around him, the air growing thick and damp. He was just about to give up and turn back when the path suddenly opened into a small clearing. Tom froze, his blood running cold at the sight before him. Scattered all across the forest floor were dozens of objects, tents, backpacks, camping gear, all in various states of decay. Some items looked relatively new, while others had clearly been there for years, half buried in the leaf litter on the forest floor. With shaking hands, Tom approached the nearest backpack. He unzipped it slowly, dreading what he might find inside. Clothes, a water bottle, a guidebook to the Appalachian Trail, and there, tucked into a side pocket, a wallet. Tom pulled it out. His heart was pounding as he flipped it open to reveal a driver's license. Sarah Johnson, missing hiker, he whispered, recognizing the name from a case that had gone cold 2 summers ago. The search parties had combed these woods for weeks, but had found no trace of the young woman who had vanished. Tom stumbled back with his mind reeling. This wasn't just some dumping ground for stolen gear. This was evidence of something far more sinister. He fumbled for his radio, desperate to call for help, but the device emitted nothing but static. A twig snapped behind him. Tom whirled around, his hand's instinctive pistol at his hip, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Heart pounding, Tom knew he had to get out of there and report what he had found. He turned to leave, but as he did, something caught his eye. There, half hidden beneath the roots of a massive oak tree, was the entrance to what looked like a cave. Against his better judgment, Tom approached the dark opening. The stench hit him first, nauseating mix of rot and decay that made him gag. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam illuminating a narrow passageway that disappeared deep into the earth. Tom hesitated at the threshold, every fiber of his being screaming at him to turn and run. But he was a park ranger, sworn to protect and serve. If there was even a chance that someone was alive down there, he had to investigate. Taking a deep breath, Tom ducked into the cave. The passageway was cramped and winding, forcing him to crouch as he made his way deeper underground. The air grew colder, the stench more intense. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, the sound echoing ominously off the stone wall. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up to a large cavern. Tom's flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The cave was a makeshift living area, filled with crude furniture and primitive tools, but it was the walls that made Tom's blood run cold. They were covered in countless tally marks, scratched into the stone with what looked like fingernails, and hanging from crude hooks were dozens and dozens of human skulls, their empty eye sockets staring accusingly at the intruder. Tom stumbled backwards, bile rising in his throat. He had to get out of here, had to warn someone about what he had found, but as he turned to flee, a low growl froze him in place. There, blocking the exit, stood a figure that barely, just barely resembled a human being. It was massively built. Its misshapen body covered in patches of matted hair. Its face was a nightmare of protruding teeth and sunken eyes that gleamed with feral hunger. Tom reached for his gun, but he was too slow. The creature lunged forward with inhuman speed, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. Tom's head cracked against the stone floor, and the world went black. When Tom regained consciousness, he found himself bound hand and foot, lying on a cold stone surface. His head throbbed, and the coppery taste of blood filled his mouth. As his vision cleared, he realized with horror that he was not alone. The cavern was filled with people, if you could still call them that. Men, women, and children of all ages, their bodies twisted and deformed by generations of inbreeding. They moved about with an unsettling, shuffling gait, communicating in grunts and guttural noises that barely resembled human speech. An ancient woman approached Tom, her spine bent at an impossible angle, her milky eyes fixed on his face. She reached out a gnarled hand, running it over his cheek in an almost tender gesture. Then she turned to the others and let out a series of sharp barks. The cavern erupted into a frenzy of activity. Tom watched in horror as the creatures began preparing what could only be described as a feast. Crude stone knives were sharpened. A fire was stoked in the center of the cavern, and the worst of all, a massive iron pot was dragged into view. Tom struggled against his bonds, but it was useless. The ropes cut into his flesh, drawing blood that only seemed to excite his captors further. He tried to reason with them, to plead for his life, but his words fell on deaf ears. As the preparations continued, Tom's mind raced. How long had this community been living here, hidden away from the world? How many innocent hikers and campers had fallen victim to their hunger over the years? And how had no one ever discovered them? The answer, he realized, with a sickening jolt, was right in front of him. The skulls on the wall, the personal belongings in the clearing. These creatures were experts at covering their tracks. They took everything from their victims, leaving no trace behind, and in these vast, isolated mountains, it was all too easy for people to simply just disappear. Tom thought of his wife Sarah waiting for him at home. Would she become another grieving family member, forever wondering what happened to her loved one? The thought gave him a sudden surge of strength. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let these monsters win. With renewed determination, Tom began working at his bonds, ignoring the pain as the rough rope scraped his wrists raw. He had to get free. He had to find a way to alert the authorities before more innocent people fell victim to this horrendous, hidden horror. Hours passed, marked only by the increased activity in the cave. Tom's captors seemed to be preparing for some kind of ritual, painting crude symbols on their bodies with a mixture of ash, and what he feared was blood. The ancient woman presided over it all. Her unseeing eyes somehow managed to convey a sense of anticipation. As night fell, the atmosphere in the cave changed. The creatures became more agitated, their movements more frenzied. Tom realized with growing dread that the time for the feast was approaching. He redoubled his efforts to escape, feeling the ropes finally begin to loosen. And just as he felt the bindings give way, a hush fell over the cavern. The crowd parted, revealing a massive figure emerging from a side tunnel. It was even larger than the one that had attacked Tom, its misshapen head nearly brushing the ceiling of the cave. In its arms, it carried a squirming bundle. Tom's heart sank as he realized it was a child, a young boy no more than 7 or 8 years old. The kid's face was streaked with tears, his eyes wide with terror as he was brought before the ancient woman. She examined the boy critically, running her gnarled hand over his face and limbs. Then she nodded, a gruesome smile revealing blackened stumps of teeth. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of howls and shrieks, and the sound echoing off the walls in a deafening roar. Tom knew he was out of time. With a final, desperate effort, he tore free of his bonds and lurched to his feet. The sudden movement sent a wave of dizziness washing over him, and he fought through it, scanning the cave for a weapon, an exit, anything that might give him a chance. His eyes fell on his backpack, discarded in a corner, along with his other gear. If he could just reach it, he might be able to get his flare gun. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan he had. Tom made a break for it, using the creature's momentary distraction to his advantage. He dove for the pack, his fingers crossing around the familiar fabric just as a howl of rage went up behind him. They'd noticed his escape. Hands grabbed at him, clawing and tearing as he fought to open the backpack. Tom's fingers closed around the cold metal of the flare gun just as he was yanked backwards, his body slamming against the unforgiving stone floor. The massive creature loomed over him, its foul breath hot on his face as it prepared to deliver a killing blow. And in that moment, time seemed to slow down. Tom saw the young boy still clutched in the arms of another monster. He saw the ancient woman, her sightless eyes somehow filled with malevolent glee, and he saw generations of victims, their spirits crying out for justice. With the last of his strength, Tom raised the flare gun and fired. The cavern erupted in a blinding flash of red light. The creatures howled in pain and confusion, their eyes unaccustomed to such brightness. In the chaos, Tom scrambled to his feet, scooping up the young boy as he ran for the exit. He had no idea if he was going the right way, simply letting instinct guide him through the twisting tunnels. Behind him, he could hear the enraged shrieks of his pursuers, growing closer with each passing second. Just when Tom thought his lungs would burst, he saw a glimmer of moonlight ahead. With a final burst of speed, he shot out of the cave and into the cool night air. But he couldn't stop running. He knew the creatures were right behind him, their inhuman stamina allowing them to chase him tirelessly through the forest. Tom's mind raced as he crashed through the underbrush, the terrified boy clinging to him like a lifeline. He needed a plan. He needed to find a way to alert the authorities before these monsters disappeared back into the wilderness. And then, as if in answer to his desperate prayers, Tom heard the distinct whoop, 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 whoop of helicopter blades. Search and rescue must have been out looking for him. His absence had not gone unnoticed. With renewed hope, Tom changed direction, heading for the small clearing he knew was nearby. It was used as a landing zone for emergency evacuations, and right now, it was his only chance for survival. He burst into the open space just as the helicopter's searchlight swept across the trees. Tom waved his arms frantically, shouting at the top of his lungs. The light fixed on him, and he saw the craft begin to descend. But his relief was short-lived. From the edge of the clearing came an inhuman roar of rage. The creature had caught up to him, and they weren't about to let their prey escape. Tom turned to face them, placing himself between the monsters and the young boy. He was unarmed, exhausted, and in no shape for a fight. But he'd be damned if he'd let these things hurt anyone else. The largest of the creatures charged forward, its massive arms outstretched to crush the life from Tom. But before it could reach him, a spotlight from above illuminated the scene. The helicopter had landed, and armed park rangers were pouring out, their weapons trained on the horrific sight before them. For a moment, everything froze. The creatures, unused to such a display of force, hesitated. It was all the time the rangers needed. A hail of tranquilizer darts flew through the air, finding their marks with pinpoint accuracy. One by one, the monsters fell, their shrieks fading into unconsciousness. Tom felt his legs give out beneath him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was finally wearing off, and as he sank to the ground, he pulled the young boy close, whispering words of comfort. The next few hours passed in a blur. Tom was taken to a hospital, treated for his injuries, and debriefed by a team of increasingly incredulous law enforcement officials. Search parties were dispatched to the cave system, uncovering horrors beyond their imagination. In the days and weeks that followed, the full story began to emerge. The creatures were the descendants of a group of settlers who had become stranded in the mountains over a century ago. Isolated and desperate, they had turned to cannibalism to survive. Over generations, inbreeding and their gruesome diet had warped them both physically and mentally, turning them into the monsters that Tom had encountered. The young boy, it turned out, was the son of hikers who had gone missing earlier that year. He had been kept alive, presumably to be fattened up for a future meal. Tom's heart broke as he thought of what the child had endured, but he was grateful that at least one innocent life had been saved. As for the creatures themselves, they were taken into custody. Those that survived the initial confrontation, at least. Science and doctors struggled to classify them, debating whether they could still be considered human. The ethical and legal questions surrounding their fate would be debated for years to come. Tom returned to work eventually, but things were never quite the same. He found himself jumping at shadows, startling at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. The horrors he had witnessed had left scars that went far deeper than the physical ones that marked his body. But he also felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. Tom threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, determined to make the park as safe as possible for visitors. He gave lectures on wilderness safety, stressing the importance of staying on marked trails and always letting someone know your plans. And on quiet nights, when the moon hung low over the mountains, Tom would sit on his porch and look out at the vast wilderness beyond. He knew that the creatures he had encountered were gone, their reign of terror finally at an end. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there were other secrets out there, hidden in the dark hollows and valleys of the Appalachians. As he sipped his coffee and listened to the chorus of night insects, Tom made a silent vow. He would remain vigilant, ready to face whatever horrors might lurk in the shadows. For he had seen the darkness that could hide behind the beauty of nature, and he was determined to never let it catch anyone unaware again. In the years that followed, the story of the cannibal clan became something of a local legend. Despite efforts to keep the details under wraps, rumors spread like wildfire. Some dismissed it as nothing more than a campfire tale, a way to scare tourists and add a thrill to their mountain adventures. But for those who knew the truth, the park rangers, the search and rescue teams, and the handful of survivors, the reality was far more terrifying than any story. They carried the weight of that knowledge with them, a burden that set them apart from those who could still look at the mountains and see only beauty. And deep in the heart of the Appalachians, in caves yet undiscovered and hollows untouched by human feet, who knows what other secrets are out there?